Imagine the silence of your own home at midnight. You've locked every door, but the air still feels heavy, as if someone is breathing in sync with you from the shadows. Your phone vibrates, not with a scream, but with a voice so smooth it feels like a physical caress. He doesn't ask what your favorite scary movie is, he asks why you're so lonely. Tonight, we step into the glass fortress of Sidney Prescott, where the line between fear and desire is a razor's edge. If you're ready to see what happens when the mask becomes a mirror, hit that like button and subscribe. Before we begin the first chapter, comment your city below and let us know you're attending this dark reunion. The wind outside the Prescott estate didn't just howl, it sighed, a restless morning sound that rattled the floor-to-ceiling glass panes of the living room. Sidney Prescott sat alone, the amber glow of a single designer lamp casting long dramatic shadows across the minimalist furniture. She was wrapped in a robe of heavy black silk that clung to her skin like a secret, a glass of dark Merlot sweating on the marble coaster beside her. This was her sanctuary, or perhaps her gilded cage, a fortress of solitude built on the ruins of a past she had tried to bury under layers of expensive therapy and miles of distance. Her life now was a series of controlled silences. She enjoyed the quiet, or so she told herself. But as she watched the rain streak down the glass, there was a familiar treacherous heat rising in her chest, the kind of restless energy that usually preceded a storm. The chime of her phone didn't startle her, it vibrated against the marble with a low rhythmic hum that felt inexplicably intimate. She didn't recognize the number. Most people would have let it go to voicemail, but Sidney felt a strange magnetic pull toward the device. Her fingers, tipped with a deep blood-red polish, hovered over the screen before she swiped to answer. She didn't speak. She waited, her own breath shallow and deliberate. "You sound lonely, Sidney." The voice was a velvet rasp, low and vibrating with a confidence that felt like a physical touch. It wasn't the distorted metallic growl of a monster. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly what color lace she was wearing beneath that silk. "Are you?" Sidney's pulse quickened, a flush creeping up her neck that had nothing to do with the wine. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a breathless edge. "A friend. An admirer. Someone who's been watching you try to pretend you don't miss the thrill," the caller replied. There was a faint sound on the other end, the rhythmic click of a lighter perhaps, or the slow exhale of smoke. "It's been a long time since anyone really looked at you, hasn't it? Not just saw you but studied you." "You're trespassing," Sidney whispered, though she didn't move to check the locks. She found herself standing, walking toward the window, her reflection ghosting over the dark woods outside. "I'm exactly where you want me to be," the voice purred. "I can hear your heart, Sidney. It's racing. Is it fear? Or is it because it's been so long since someone made you feel this, significant?" The ambiguity of the threat was intoxicating. He wasn't talking about a knife, he was talking about an invasion of the self. He described the way she moved through the house, the way she had paused at the mirror earlier to trace the line of her collarbone, the way she lingered in the doorway of her bedroom as if waiting for a ghost. Every word was a caress, a slow, deliberate stripping away of her defenses. "What do you want?" she breathed, her forehead leaning against the cold glass. "I want to see how far you'll let me in before you scream," he whispered. "I want to know if you still have that fire in you, or if you've let the world turn you into stone." "You're shivering, Sidney. Is the house too cold? Or is it me?" The line went dead, leaving only the sound of the rain and the heavy, thudding rhythm of her own heart. The silence that followed was no longer empty, it was pregnant with a dangerous, seductive weight. She clutched the silk of her robe tighter, her skin tingling as if the voice were still echoing in the room, a phantom touch that promised both ruin and a terrifying kind of awakening. She looked out into the darkness, knowing that somewhere out there, a pair of eyes was savoring the sight of her fear, and for the first time in years, Sidney Prescott felt truly, dangerously alive. The morning light offered no sanctuary. It filtered through the high windows of the local botanical conservatory, a place Sidney had chosen for its transparency. Surrounded by glass and greenery, there should have been nowhere for a shadow to hide. Yet, as she walked through the humid orchid-heavy air, the silk of her blouse felt too thin, as if the eyes from the previous night were still tracing the curve of her spine. She stopped before a cluster of bleeding heart flowers, their pink and white bells dangling like droplets. Her mind was a chaotic loop of that velvet voice on the phone. "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" She closed her eyes, trying to breathe in the damp earth, but all she could smell was the phantom scent of rain and expensive tobacco. "They suit you," a voice remarked. It wasn't the voice from the phone, it was deeper, grounded in a way that made the air in the room suddenly feel twice as heavy. Beautiful, but always looking like they're about to break. Sydney froze. That voice was a ghost she had spent a lifetime trying to exorcise. She turned slowly, her heart performing a slow, agonizing thud against her ribs. Standing a few feet away, leaning against a wrought iron pillar, was Billy Loomis. He looked older, the boyish cruelty of his youth matured into something far more sophisticated and twice as dangerous. He wore a charcoal gray coat tailored to a frame that had filled out with a predatory grace. His dark hair was swept back, and his eyes, those dark, unreadable pits of obsidian, were fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "Billy," she breathed, the name tasting like copper and old secrets. "Sydney." He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a high-strung animal. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Or perhaps just a man who couldn't stay away. What are you doing here? After everything?" Sydney's hand went instinctively to her throat, her fingers brushing the skin where the caller's words had seemed to linger. "I heard the silence was getting loud for you again," he said, stopping just inches from her. The heat radiating from him was visceral, a sharp contrast to the cool mist of the conservatory. "I told myself I'd stay in the shadows, let you have your peace. But then I saw you yesterday, walking toward that big, empty house, and I realized, some things never change. You're still looking for a reason to run." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. Sydney should have flinched. She should have screamed. But the soap opera drama of the moment held her paralyzed. His fingers didn't touch her skin, not yet, but the proximity was a provocation. He traced the air an inch from her jawline, his gaze dropping to her lips with a hunger that was barely contained. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, though her body leaned into the space he occupied. "I know," he murmured, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. "But we've always been drawn to the things that ruin us, haven't we? It's our shared language." Finally, his fingers made contact. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering a second, 2 seconds, beyond what was accidental. The pads of his fingers were slightly rough, sending a jolt of electricity through her that made her breath hitch. It wasn't just a gesture of comfort, it was an act of reclamation. He was studying her, the way the light hit the pulse point in her neck, the way her chest rose and fell in ragged intervals. "I'm not that girl anymore, Billy," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and a forbidden rising heat. "No," he agreed, his eyes darkening as they swept over her. "You're much more interesting now. There's a ripeness to your fear, Sydney. It's intoxicating." He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, mirroring the intimacy of the caller from the night before. "I can feel your heart beating, Sydney. It's practically screaming. Tell me, is it because you hate me? Or because you've missed the way I make you feel like the only person in the world who matters?" The ambiguity of his presence was a blade at her throat. Was he her protector, or was he the one who had dialed her number in the dark? He stood so close that the buttons of his coat brushed against her silk blouse, a slow, friction-filled movement that made her skin flush. The tension between them was a living thing, a coiled spring of unresolved desire and ancient wounds. Before she could answer, a group of tourists rounded the corner, their loud chatter shattering the fragile, heavy bubble they were in. Billy stepped back, the mask of a casual acquaintance sliding effortlessly back into place. But the look he gave her, a slow, hooded glance that promised a continuation of this private war, left her breathless. "I'll be seeing you, Sydney," he said, his voice a silken promise. "I don't think either of us is finished with this story yet." He turned and disappeared into the lush greenery, leaving Sydney standing among the bleeding hearts, her body trembling with a terrifying, delicious dread. The game hadn't just begun, it had evolved. The rain had returned, but this time it wasn't a sigh, it was a rhythmic drumming against the roof of the Prescott estate, a persistent heartbeat that seemed to sync with Sydney's own. The house felt larger at night, the shadows stretching across the polished floorboards like ink stains. Sydney sat in the library, a room lined with leather-bound books that smelled of aging paper and cedar. She wasn't reading. She was staring at the phone on the mahogany desk, waiting for it to vibrate, waiting for the electronic pulse that had become her only connection to a reality that felt increasingly like a fever dream. She was dressed in a slip of midnight blue satin that felt like cool water against her skin. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if she were being watched by 1,000 eyes hidden in the wainscoting. The encounter with Billy at the conservatory had left her skin feeling sensitized, raw. His touch had been a spark in a dry forest, and now, the fire was smoldering. The phone didn't ring. Instead, the lights flickered, once, twice, and then died. The sudden darkness was absolute. Sydney froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. The silence of the house was now heavy, thick with the scent of the storm and something else. Something like ozone and expensive cologne. "Tell me, Sydney." The voice didn't come from the phone this time. It came from the surround sound speakers integrated into the walls, a smooth surround sound intimacy that made it feel as if the caller were standing directly behind her, whispering into the nape of her neck. "Who do you trust when the lights go out?" Sydney gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "How are you doing this? How are you in my system?" "I'm in everything, Sydney," the voice purred, the sound moving from the left speaker to the right, circling her in a sonic embrace. "I'm in the walls. I'm in your history. I'm in the thoughts you try to drown with that Merlot." A flash of lightning illuminated the room for a split second. In the strobe-like glare, she saw a figure standing by the French doors, or was it just a trick of the light and the heavy velvet curtains? "Is it Billy?" The voice continued, dropping to a lower, more provocative register. "Do you trust the man who broke you, just because he's the only one who knows how the pieces fit? Or do you trust yourself, knowing that the same blood that fueled your mother's appetites runs through your veins?" "Don't talk about her," Sydney snapped, though her voice lacked conviction. The mention of her mother always felt like a physical blow, a reminder of the hidden affairs and the secret lives that had birthed this cycle of violence. "Why not?" She knew the power of a secret. She knew that some things are only felt in the dark, the caller whispered. "Do you remember the way Billy looked at you today? That wasn't the look of a man seeking redemption. That was the look of a man who remembers exactly how you felt under his hands. And you liked it, didn't you? The danger. The way your pulse hammered against his palm." Sydney felt a wave of heat wash over her, a traitorous reaction to the voice's words. The ambiguity of the killer's intent was a weapon more effective than any blade. He wasn't threatening to kill her, he was threatening to expose her to herself. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the rug, and began to move toward the door. As she passed the tall floor-length mirror in the hallway, another flash of lightning struck. For a heartbeat, her reflection didn't look like her. It looked like her mother, young, vibrant, and trapped in a world of beautiful deceptions. "You're questioning everything now, aren't you?" the voice asked, now sounding closer, as if it were coming from a handset she wasn't holding. "Your history with Billy. Was it love, or was it just a very long, very beautiful prelude to a slaughter? And your mother. Did she ever tell you about the nights she spent wishing she could escape the life she built for you?" Sydney reached the kitchen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air here was cooler, smelling of stainless steel and rain. She reached for a knife, not for protection, but for the grounding weight of the metal. "Put it down, Sydney," the voice said, now coming from the smart refrigerator screen, which flickered to life with a grainy black and white feed of the room she was currently standing in. "You don't want to ruin the aesthetic. We're just getting to the good part." In the video feed, she saw herself, a pale ghost in blue satin. And behind her, just at the edge of the frame, a shadow moved. A tall, slender silhouette that lingered in the doorway before vanishing into the darkness of the hall. "Who's there?" she cried out, turning around. The kitchen was empty. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the rain. But the air was charged, electric with a presence she couldn't see but could feel in every nerve ending. "The truth is a game, Sydney," the voice whispered, fading into a low melodic hum. "And you've always been the prize. Sleep well. Dream of the secrets you're still keeping from yourself. I'll be watching." The power snapped back on, the sudden glare of the overhead lights blinding her. When her eyes adjusted, the kitchen was perfectly normal. The screen on the refrigerator was back to displaying a serene image of a mountain range. But as Sydney looked down, she saw a single dark rose petal resting on the counter. It was wet, as if it had just been plucked from a garden in the rain. She picked it up, the velvet texture of the petal a silent, seductive promise. The horror was no longer just about survival, it was a psychological seduction, a slow-burn descent into a past that refused to stay buried. The velvet rope of the obsidian room parted for Sydney as if she were royalty returning to a kingdom she had once burned to the ground. The lounge was a masterclass in soap opera decadence, low-slung leather booths, flickering candlelight that made everyone look like a conspirator, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of expensive gin and night-blooming jasmine. Sydney wore a dress of crimson silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, the slit up the thigh revealing just enough to be a provocation. She needed to feel powerful tonight. She needed to feel like the hunter, not the prey. She had barely touched her drink, a martini as cold as her resolve, when a burst of laughter shattered the curated mood of the room. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world of hushed secrets. It was jagged, loud, and vibrated with a manic energy that made the hair on Sydney's arms stand up. "Sydney. My God, look at you. You're like a sunset, beautiful to look at, but everyone knows the darkness is coming right behind you." She didn't have to turn around. She knew that voice. It was the sound of a childhood nightmare rewritten with a modern, cruel twist. Stu Macker stepped into her line of sight, and the air around him seemed to hum with a chaotic, kinetic frequency. Stu hadn't aged the way Billy had. Where Billy was a brooding statue, Stu was a live wire. He was lean and restless, dressed in a sheer black shirt that left little to the imagination, his movements jerky and unpredictable. He leaned over the back of Sydney's booth, his face dropping inches from hers. His eyes were wide, dilated, and fixed on her with an intensity that felt less like a greeting and more like a voyeuristic invasion. "Stu," Sydney managed, her voice tight. "I heard you were around." "Around? Sid, I'm everywhere. I'm the spice in the stew. I'm the glitch in the matrix." He laughed again, a high-pitched sound that drew looks from the surrounding tables. He didn't care. He reached out and plucked the olive from her drink, popping it into his mouth with a slow, exaggerated wink. Salty. Just like your reputation." He slid into the booth next to her, crowding her space until their thighs pressed together through the thin fabric of her dress. The heat coming off him was different from Billy's. It was feverish, almost sickly. He leaned in close, his nose brushing the shell of her ear. "I saw you at the conservatory today," he whispered, his voice suddenly dropping into a low, terrifyingly intimate tone. "With Billy. You two looked like a movie poster. All that, unresolved tension. I almost felt like I should be charging admission just to watch you two breathe at each other." Sydney's heart hammered. "You were watching us?" "I'm always watching, Sid. It's my favorite hobby. You have such expressive shoulders. They get so tight when you're nervous. I could feel it from 50 yards away. It made me wonder, if I touched them right now, would you shatter, or would you just melt?" His hand moved, his long fingers trailing a path from her shoulder down to the small of her back. It wasn't a comforting touch, it was a claim. It was the touch of someone who enjoyed the discomfort he was causing. He began to draw invisible patterns on her skin, his eyes never leaving hers, his pupils flickering with a terrifying delight. "You're making people uncomfortable, Stu," Sydney said, trying to pull away, but the booth was deep and he was relentless. "Comfort is boring, Sydney." "Comfort is for people who don't have stories worth telling," Stu countered, leaning even closer until she could smell the peppermint on his breath. He lowered his voice even further, his eyes darting to the entrance where Billy Loomis had just appeared, standing in the shadows like a sentinel. "Billy likes to play the hero, doesn't he? The dark, mysterious protector. But we know the truth, don't we? He just wants to own the cage you're in." "Me? I just want to see what happens when the cage door is left slightly ajar." He laughed again, but this time it was a private sound, meant only for her. He reached out and adjusted the strap of her dress, his fingers lingering on the bare skin of her shoulder just a second too long. The ambiguity of his energy was suffocating. Was he a jester, or was he the one who had held the phone while the voice whispered about her secrets? Billy approached the table, his presence instantly cooling the air. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, the lounge felt like a powder keg. The dynamic between them was charged with a history that Sydney couldn't quite decipher, a mix of brotherhood, rivalry, and something deeper, something darker. "Stu," Billy said, his voice a low warning. "You're crowding the lady." "Oh, come on, Billy. Sid likes the crowd. She's been lonely so long, she's practically vibrating with the need for attention," Stu joked, his eyes flashing with a wicked spark. He stood up slowly, his gaze sweeping over Sydney one last time with a hunger that was almost palpable. "I'll leave you two to your brooding. But remember, Sid, the best parts of the movie are the ones they have to cut for the R rating. And I've got the unrated version playing in my head 24/7. He sauntered away, his walk a rhythmic, cocky sway that demanded attention. Sydney felt a cold sweat break out on her neck. Stu hadn't just entered the game, he had changed the rules. His presence turned the psychological tension into something visceral, something voyeuristic, and deeply, dangerously personal. She looked at Billy, who was now sitting where Stu had been. The seat was still warm. "He's getting worse," Billy murmured, watching Stu disappear into the crowd. "He's lost the ability to distinguish the performance from the reality." "And you, Billy?" Sydney asked, her voice trembling. "Can you?" Billy didn't answer. He simply reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His grip was firm, grounding, and yet, it felt like a trap. The triangle was complete: Billy the anchor, Stu the chaos, and Sydney, the center of a storm that was only just beginning to break. The storm had reached a fever pitch, transforming the world outside the Prescott estate into a blurring wash of charcoal and silver. Inside, the power outage had rendered the house a labyrinth of ink. The only light came from a scattered collection of pillar candles Sydney had managed to light, their amber flames dancing wildly in the drafts that snaked through the floorboards. The air was thick with the scent of melting wax and the sharp metallic tang of the rain. Sydney stood by the fireplace, her silhouette flickering against the walls. She had shed the crimson dress from the lounge, now draped in a simple, oversized cashmere sweater that did little to hide the way she trembled. Across the room, Billy Loomis moved with the quiet efficiency of a predator in his natural habitat. He had discarded his coat, his white shirt damp from the dash from the car, the fabric clinging to the broad lines of his shoulders and the hollow of his throat. "You should sit down, Sydney," Billy murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to cut through the roar of the thunder. "You're wound so tight I can hear your nerves humming." "How can I sit?" Sydney turned to him, the candlelight catching the unshed tears in her eyes. "Stu is out there. Someone is in my phone, in my head. And you just walk back into my life like the last 15 years were a commercial break." Billy stepped into the circle of light. The moisture on his skin glistened, and as he approached, Sydney could smell the rain on him, cold, fresh, and dangerously inviting. He didn't stop until he was inches away. The heat radiating from his body was a physical force, a silent plea for her to stop fighting the inevitable. "I didn't walk back in, Sid," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her mouth before locking back onto her eyes. "I never really left. Every woman I've been with, every city I've lived in. I was just looking for the ghost of you." It was a line straight out of a tragedy, delivered with the soulful conviction of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle her defenses. Sydney felt her resolve crumbling. The isolation, the fear, and the sheer intoxicating proximity of the man who had been her first everything combined into a volatile cocktail. He reached out, his hands ghosting over her waist, drawing her slowly toward him. The cashmere of her sweater felt abrasive against the sensitized skin of her arms. Her breath hitched, her chest rising and falling in a ragged rhythm that mirrored the storm outside. "Is this part of the game, Billy?" she breathed, her hands resting tentatively on his damp chest. She could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart beneath the cotton. "The dog protector routine?" "If it's a game, we're both losing," he replied, his voice dropping to a rasp. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Their breaths mingled, a shared humid space that felt more private than the darkness surrounding them. His hand moved upward, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip with a slow, deliberate pressure that sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. The ambiguity of the moment was a heavy weight. Was this love, or was it the ultimate manipulation? His touch was tender, yet there was an underlying possessiveness that made her skin flush. He pulled her closer, the friction of their bodies creating a heat that defied the cold house. For a moment, the world outside, the murders, the phone calls, the mask, ceased to exist. There was only the taste of salt on his skin and the heavy, desperate pull of a desire that had been suppressed for far too long. Then, the silence was shattered. The phone on the mantelpiece didn't ring with its usual chime. It emitted a low, electronic pulse, a digital heartbeat. Sydney froze. The spell broke instantly, the heat in the room replaced by a sudden, icy dread. Billy's grip tightened for a second before he let her go, his eyes narrowing. Sydney picked up the phone. She didn't even have to press a button, the speaker activated on its own. "You really thought he was different, Sydney?" The voice was closer than it had ever been, echoing not just from the phone but seemingly from the very shadows of the room. It was Ghostface, but the tone had shifted. The flirtatiousness was gone, replaced by a cold, mocking clarity. "You let him in." Again. You let the wolf into the nursery because he whispered a few pretty lies about ghosts. Sydney looked at Billy. He stood perfectly still, the candlelight carving his face into a mask of shadows and sharp angles. He didn't look like a lover anymore. He looked like a statue, cold, calculating and unreadable. Look at him, Sydney, the voice urged, a silken thread of malice. Look at the way he watches you. Is that love? Or is he just checking to see if you're ripe enough to harvest? Billy took a step toward her, his hand reaching out. Sid, give me the phone. Don't touch me, she whispered, backing away into the darkness. The storm is just beginning, Sydney, the voice laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. And in the dark, everyone looks like a monster. Especially the ones you want to trust. The line went dead. Outside, a bolt of lightning struck so close the house shook to its foundations. In the brief, blinding flash, Sydney saw Billy standing in the center of the room. For that split second, his shadow on the wall behind him looked monstrous, long distorted, and holding something that looked terrifyingly like a blade. When the darkness returned, Sydney was no longer sure who she was trapped with. The intimacy had been a trap, and the night had only just begun to bleed. The silence that followed the phone's disconnection was more deafening than the thunder. Sydney stood paralyzed, her back against the cold, damp stone of the fireplace. The single candle on the mantel flickered, its dying light casting a halo around Billy's head, making him look like a fallen saint. He didn't move. He didn't chase her. He simply stood there, his white shirt translucent against his skin, the rhythm of his breathing finally slowing into something rhythmic, almost meditative. Billy. Sydney's voice was a ghost of itself. Say something. Tell me that voice was lying. Billy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and slowly, methodically, began to button the cuffs of his shirt, which he had rolled up in their earlier moment of vulnerability. The movement was precise, devoid of the warmth he had projected only minutes ago. When he finally looked up, the darkness in his eyes was no longer a mystery to be solved, it was a settled fact. The voice didn't lie, Sydney, he said, his tone as smooth and polished as a river stone. But it didn't tell the whole truth, either. It's not about the wolf in the nursery. It's about the nursery being built for the wolf. He took a slow step toward her. He wasn't rushing. He didn't have to. The power was out, the doors were locked from the inside, and he had already dismantled the only thing that could have saved her, her hope. You were always the final girl, Sydney, he whispered, stopping just outside her personal space. The heat was still there, the same magnetic pull that had nearly driven her to surrender in Chapter 5, but now it felt clinical. Every movie, every tragedy needs a center. A heart that bleeds beautifully. I didn't come back to kill you. I came back to finish the edit. The edit. Sydney's hand trembled as she reached for a heavy brass candlestick, but Billy's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with a strength that was both terrifying and strangely, darkly intimate. Don't, he murmured, pulling her hand down. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The scent of rain and adrenaline was intoxicating. You've spent 15 years trying to write your own ending, trying to be safe. But safety is a lie we tell children. You're only truly yourself when you're on the edge of the blade. When you're breathless, not from a kiss, but from the realization that I own the air in your lungs. His thumb traced the pulse in her wrist, wild, erratic, and entirely under his control. The ambiguity of the moment was suffocating. He was holding her like a lover and a prisoner simultaneously, his body a barricade she no longer wanted to cross. Surprised. A new voice chirped from the shadows of the hallway. Stu Macker stepped into the dim light of the library, looking utterly delighted. He was wearing the ghost face mask, but it was pushed up onto his forehead like a pair of sunglasses, revealing a face flushed with a manic, boyish glee. He was holding a glass of Sydney's Merlot, sipping it with an exaggerated elegance that felt like a mockery of her life. I told you, Sid. The unrated version. Stu laughed, his eyes dancing between Sydney and Billy. The look on your face, it's better than any test screening. Billy man, you really had her going with that ghost of you speech. I almost cried. Seriously. Stu was the audience, Billy explained, his gaze never leaving Sydney's. He watched us in the conservatory. He watched us tonight. He understands the beauty of the performance. Sydney felt a wave of nausea, followed by a searing white-hot fury. The intimacy of the previous hour hadn't been a lapse in judgment, it had been a choreographed scene, a psychological stripping away designed to make this betrayal hurt more than a knife ever could. This was never about murder, Sydney breathed, the realization dawning on her. Murder is messy. Murder is a period at the end of a sentence, Billy said, his voice dropping to a low, seductive purr as he leaned closer, his chest brushing against the cashmere of her sweater. He moved his hand from her wrist to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, pulling her head back just enough to expose the line of her throat. This is about power, Sydney. It's about control. It's about rewriting your pain through a performance only we can give you. I didn't want your life. I wanted your surrender. He looked at her with a terrifyingly clear obsession. In his mind he wasn't a killer, he was a director, and Sydney was his muse, a woman he had broken and rebuilt until she was a masterpiece of trauma. Stu stepped closer, his presence adding a voyeuristic crowded energy to the room. He leaned over Billy's shoulder, his eyes fixed on Sydney's trembling lips. You look so cinematic right now, Sid. Don't you feel it? The weight of the scene? The way the air is literally screaming for a climax. The two men stood over her, a duo of architects who had spent years designing this specific moment of despair. They didn't need masks anymore. The truth was far more terrifying. They had used love, desire, and the ghosts of her past to lure her into a room where the only exit was through them. You're both insane, Sydney whispered. No, Sydney, Billy replied, his lips ghosting over her ear in a final cruel mimicry of affection. We're just the only ones who truly understand the story. And now, it's time for Act 4. The library had become a stage, the flickering candlelight casting long distorted shadows that seemed to applaud the reveal. Billy's hand remained tangled in Sydney's hair, a grip that was firm but possessed a terrifying rhythmic gentleness, like a man stroking a bird he intended to crush. Stu hovered in the periphery, his presence of voyeuristic weight, sipping the Merlot as if he were watching a masterpiece in a private gallery. You think this is about a movie, Sid? Billy whispered, his voice vibrating against the shell of her ear. The heat of him was inescapable, a suffocating contrast to the chill of the storm-battered room. Movies offer people who can't handle the real thing. This is legacy. This is blood. Sydney tried to pull away, but the movement only caused him to tighten his hold, forcing her head back further. Her throat was exposed, a pale, pulsing line in the dim light. You're obsessed, Billy. You're sick. Obsession is just another word for devotion, he countered, his eyes dark with a feverish light. He let go of her hair only to slide his hand down the front of her cashmere sweater, his palm flat against her heart. Your mother, Maureen. She understood devotion. She didn't just have affairs, Sydney. She had devotees. She knew how to make men feel like they were the only things that existed, right before she dismantled them. She was a siren, Sydney. And you have that same siren song in your marrow. Don't talk about her like you knew her, Sydney spat, though her breath was coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The proximity of him, the way his body seemed to pulse with a dark energy, was triggering a traitorous response in her. Her skin felt electric, sensitized by the very man who was destroying her. I knew the woman she made my father into, Billy said, his voice dropping into a low, mournful register that felt like a caress. A man who would burn his own house down just to see her glow in the embers. She destroyed my family, not with a knife, but with a look. With the way she'd let a man touch her just long enough to make him believe he was a god. He stepped closer, his thigh pressing between hers, a slow, deliberate movement that forced her to lean back against the mantel. The ambiguity of the contact was agonizing. It was an act of dominance disguised as a dance. She was a creator of chaos, Billy continued, his gaze drifting down to Sydney's lips. And I realized. I didn't want to just kill the legacy. I wanted to perfect it. I wanted to take the raw, bleeding heart of the Prescott curse and turn it into something eternal. Stu let out a soft, appreciative whistle from the shadows. He's a poet, Sid. Tell her the part about the masterpiece. That's my favorite. Billy's hand moved from her heart to her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her chin with a possessive heat. I've spent years watching you, Sydney. In the quiet moments. When you thought you were safe. I watched the way you carried your grief like a designer gown. It made you radiant. But you were still hiding. You were still pretending you weren't like her. He leaned in, his lips ghosting over hers, a breath away from a kiss that would be a violation. I had to break you, Sydney. I had to strip away the locks, the cameras, the final girl armor. I had to bring you to this room in the dark, so you could finally see what you are. You're not a survivor. You're the reason men go mad. Sydney felt a tear escape, tracing a path down her cheek. Billy caught it with his thumb, then tasted it, a gesture so intimate and perverse it made her stomach turn even as a wave of heat flooded her body. The soap opera drama of his words was a trap, a narrative he had woven so tightly she couldn't find the thread to pull it apart. You think pain is an ending, Billy whispered, his hand sliding lower, the friction of the cashmere against her skin creating a static charge. But pain is the ultimate truth. It's the only thing that doesn't lie. It's what connects us, Sydney. It's the only language we both speak fluently. He pulled her flush against him, the dampness of his white shirt soaking into her sweater. The air in the library was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and the looming climax of his twisted vision. He looked at her with a terrifyingly pure adoration, a look that said he would burn the world just to be the one who held her hand in the ashes. You're not just a victim in my story, Sydney, he murmured, his voice a silken thread of obsession. You're the center, the focal point, the reason the blood is shed. He tilted her head back, his eyes searching hers for a sign of the darkness he insisted was there. And in that moment, as the lightning flared and the shadows danced, he delivered the line that felt like a blade through the heart of her identity. Pain makes you beautiful, Sydney, he breathed, his voice a mix of a prayer and a threat. And tonight, I'm going to make you the most beautiful woman who ever lived. The ambiguity of his promise hung in the air, a dark, seductive weight that blurred the line between a death sentence and a terrifying new beginning. Sydney looked into his eyes and saw not a monster, but a man who had completely lost himself in the performance of her ruin. Gemini said. The air in the library was so thick with the scent of rain, salt, and the metallic tang of unspoken violence that it felt like a physical weight pressing against Sydney's chest. Billy's hand was still tangled in her hair, his thumb tracing the line of her throat with a devastating rhythmic pressure. He looked at her not as a killer looks at a victim, but as an artist looks at a canvas he is finally ready to sign. Sydney felt the heat of his body, the white-hot intensity of his obsession, and for the first time in years, she didn't pull away. She stopped trembling. She let her shoulders drop, her body going soft against the cold marble of the mantelpiece. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark, mirroring the obsidian depths of his own. You're right, Billy, she whispered, her voice a low melodic tremor that seemed to vibrate through his very skin. I've been hiding for so long. Hiding from the blood, hiding from the heat. Billy's eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. This wasn't the script he had written. Sydney. I thought I wanted peace, she continued, her hands moving slowly, almost reverently, up his chest. She felt the heavy, erratic thud of his heart against her palms. But peace is just another word for being forgotten. You didn't just break the locks, Billy. You reminded me that I'm the only one who can handle a man like you. Behind them, Stu let out a low, breathless whistle, his glass of Merlot forgotten on a side table. He stepped closer, his manic energy replaced by a sudden voyeuristic fascination. Whoa. Billy, man. She's actually doing it. She's finally waking up. Sydney turned her gaze to Stu, a slow, predatory smile touching her lips, a smile she had inherited from Maureen Prescott, the woman who knew how to turn a man's desire into his greatest weakness. You like to watch, don't you, Stu? You like the friction. You like seeing how far the final girl can go before she becomes the monster. She leaned back into Billy's embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. Her breath was warm against his neck, a deliberate, humid provocation. If pain makes me beautiful, Billy, what does it make you? My creator? Or just the first person I'm going to destroy? The ambiguity of her surrender was a masterstroke. Billy, usually the one in total control of the narrative, was suddenly off balance. The seduction he had spent years planning was being turned back on him. He tightened his grip on her hair, his eyes searching hers for a lie, but all he found was a reflection of his own dark hunger. You're playing with fire, Sydney, he rasped, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate growl. I'm the one who survived the fire, Billy. You're just the one who likes to play with the matches, she breathed. In that moment of shared, heavy silence, Sydney struck. She didn't reach for the heavy candlestick. She reached for the hidden strength of her own body. As Billy leaned in for what he thought was a kiss of total submission, Sydney drove her knee upward with a brutal clinical precision. The sound Billy made was a choked, pathetic gasp, the director suddenly reduced to a man in agony. Stu's eyes went wide. Hey, that wasn't in the... Before Stu could react, Sydney grabbed the brass candlestick and swung it with a grace that was purely cinematic. It caught Stu across the jaw, the sound of metal meeting bone echoing through the library like a gunshot. He tumbled backward, crashing into the side table and sending the glass of Merlot shattering across the floor, a dark red stain spreading like a pool of blood. Billy was on the ground, gasping, his facade of calm control shattered. Sydney stood over him, the crimson dress she had worn earlier now just a memory, replaced by the fierce, dark silhouette of a woman who had reclaimed her own story. "The problem with your movie, Billy," she said, her voice cold and sharp as a blade, "is that you forgot who the star was. I'm not the muse. I'm the survivor. And the survivor always gets the final word." She didn't wait for them to recover. She moved through the house like a shadow, her bare feet silent on the floorboards she knew by heart. She reached the security panel, which she had secretly rerouted weeks ago as a precaution she never thought she'd need. With a few quick strokes, she activated the silent alarm and the external floodlights. Outside, the darkness was instantly annihilated by a blinding white glare. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a high-pitched scream that signaled the end of the performance. When the police arrived, they found Billy and Stu incapacitated, one broken by his own obsession, the other by the very chaos he had worshipped. They were led away in handcuffs, the masks and the knives collected as evidence of a tragedy that had finally reached its finale. Sydney sat on the back of an ambulance, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the morning sun threatening to break through the grey clouds. She looked at the house, her gilded cage, and realized it was just a house again. The ghosts had been exorcised. A detective approached her, holding a plastic bag containing her phone. "It was ringing when we found it, Ms. Prescott. Must have been a lot of people worried about you." Sydney took the phone. She looked at the screen. The call logs were empty, the unknown calls had been scrubbed by whatever sophisticated system the killers had used. She felt a moment of peace, a sense of closure that she had earned with her own blood and wit. She walked toward her car, ready to leave the estate behind forever. But just as she reached the door, the phone in her hand vibrated. Once. Twice. She looked down. The screen was blank, but the vibration continued, a rhythmic, insistent pulse that felt like a heartbeat. She stared at it, her finger hovering over the screen. The silence of the morning was absolute. Then, the vibration stopped. Sydney looked up at the house one last time. In the window of the library, for a split second, she thought she saw a shadow move. A tall, slender silhouette that lingered for a heartbeat before vanishing into the light. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply got into the car and drove away, the lingering question of the phone call a silent passenger beside her. The coastal wind of Big Sur didn't howl like the storms of Woodsboro, it sang. It was a high, thin melody that whistled through the architectural vents of Sydney's new residence, a structure of cold steel and floor-to-ceiling glass perched precariously over the Pacific. Here, the world was blue, white, and infinite. There were no dark corners for a ghost to hide in, yet Sydney found herself living in a state of exquisite heightened awareness. She had traded her triple-locked fortress for a transparent cage, a choice that felt less like a quest for safety and more like a challenge to the universe. She stood on the wraparound terrace, the salt spray misting her skin. She was dressed in a robe of champagne-colored satin, the fabric so light it felt like a second skin, clinging to her with a scandalous intimacy. In her hand, she held a glass of chilled white wine, the condensation slicking her fingers. This was her new life, a curated existence of luxury and loneliness, where every sunset felt like a scene from a high-stakes drama. 3 months had passed since the library, since the blood on the floorboards, and since the look in Billy's eyes that had haunted her more than his knife ever could. The news cycles had moved on, the names Loomis and Macker fading into the tabloid archives, but for Sydney, the air remained charged. She could still feel the phantom pressure of Billy's hand on the back of her neck, a sensation so vivid it often made her breath hitch in the middle of the afternoon. She retreated inside as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and gold. The house was smart-wired, the lights humming to life at her presence, but she kept them dimmed. She preferred the twilight. It was the time when the boundary between the real and the imagined was the thinnest. She walked to the master bathroom, a space of white marble and heated floors. As she drew a bath, The steam rose in thick, aromatic clouds, scented with eucalyptus and something sharper, something that reminded her of the conservatory. She shed her robe, her reflection in the steam-fogged mirror a blur of pale skin and dark hair. She traced the line of her collarbone, remembering how Billy's eyes had lingered there. It wasn't just fear that made her pulse skip, it was the intoxicating memory of being seen so completely, so dangerously. As she lowered herself into the water, the heat was a shock, a sensory overload that made her head swim. She closed her eyes, and suddenly, she wasn't in Big Sur. She was back in the library, the candlelight flickering, the air thick with the scent of ozone. She could hear the rhythmic, low vibration of a voice, not the killer's but the man's. "You're only truly yourself when you're on the edge of the blade, Sydney." Her eyes snapped open. The bathroom was empty, the only sound the gentle lap of water against marble. But the sensation of being watched was so visceral it made her skin prickle. It wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. She dried herself slowly, her movements languid and deliberate, as if performing for an audience she couldn't see. She returned to the living area, where a single unmarked package sat on the mahogany console. It had arrived that morning, no return address, no note. She hadn't opened it. She had spent the day circling it, a moth around a flame. Now, with the house bathed in the indigo glow of dusk, she reached for the box. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tore the black paper away. Inside was a bottle of wine. Not white, but a deep dark Merlot, the exact vintage she had shared with Stu and Billy in the lounge. Beside it lay a single dried rose petal, its edges curled and black, looking like a drop of dried blood. A cold shiver raced down her spine, but beneath it, a traitorous heat bloomed in her chest. It was a provocation. A reminder that the story hadn't ended, it had simply changed locations. The phone on the console vibrated. Sydney didn't flinch. She picked it up, her thumb sliding across the screen with a calm that terrified her. She held the device to her ear, not saying a word. The silence on the other end was heavy, pregnant with a familiar rhythmic breathing. It wasn't the frantic gasping of a stalker, it was the slow, controlled inhalation of someone who was savoring a moment. "Do you like the view, Sydney?" the voice whispered. It was the smooth, velvet rasp from the very first night, the voice that had promised to see how far she'd let him in. "I thought you were in a cell," Sydney said, her voice steady, though her heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Walls offer people who believe in boundaries," the voice purred. "But you and we've always existed in the spaces between. You look beautiful tonight, Sydney. The champagne silk suits you. It looks like liquid gold in the moonlight." Sydney turned toward the glass walls, her gaze searching the dark cliffs and the crashing surf. She saw nothing but her own reflection, a woman standing on the edge of a beautiful ruin. "What do you want?" she breathed, her forehead leaning against the cool glass. "I want you to stop pretending you're waiting for the end," the voice replied, moving from the phone to the hidden speakers of the house, the surround sound intimacy wrapping around her like a shroud. "I want you to admit that the silence is the only thing you're truly afraid of. Because in the silence you have to admit, you miss the fire." The line went dead, but the music of the house shifted, a low cello-heavy melody that felt like a slow-motion fall. Sydney stood in the center of her glass fortress, the dark wine in her hand and the ghost of a touch on her skin. She wasn't the victim anymore, but she wasn't just a survivor either. She was a woman who had realized that the most dangerous part of the game wasn't the killer outside, it was the hunger he had awakened within her. She took a slow sip of the Merlot, the taste of it sharp and familiar. The first phase of the aftermath was over. The isolation had failed. The echoes were now a chorus, and Sydney Prescott was finally ready to listen. The fog in Big Sur was a living thing, a thick white shroud that swallowed the jagged cliffs and turned the Pacific into a muffled, distant memory. For Sydney, the mist was a relief, it provided a literal veil between her and a world that wouldn't stop staring. She spent her mornings walking the winding paths near the gallery district, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses and the high collar of a trench coat. Yet, even in the grey anonymity of the coast, she felt the prickle of a gaze that didn't belong to a tourist. It happened at the Vane Gallery, a brutalist concrete structure that seemed to grow out of the cliffside like a jagged tooth. Sydney had been drawn there by an installation titled The Architecture of Silence. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of expensive charcoal and rain-drenched cedar. The art was minimalist, hollowed-out frames, shattered glass suspended in resin, and mirrors that had been etched until the reflection was nothing but a haunting blur. "It's a bit masochistic, isn't it?" The voice was deep, resonant, and had a melodic cadence that made Sydney's breath hitch. She turned slowly, her heart performing that familiar, heavy thud against her ribs. Standing a few feet away was a man who seemed to be carved from the shadows of the room. He was tall with the lean, athletic build of a swimmer, dressed in a black turtleneck and tailored trousers that whispered of old money and quiet power. His face was a study in sharp angles, a high brow, a straight nose, and eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. He didn't look like Billy, nor did he possess Stu's frantic energy, but there was a gravity to him, a magnetic pull that felt disturbingly familiar. "Julian Vane," he said, extending a hand. His fingers were long and artistically slender. "I own the gallery. And you're the woman from the glass house on the point." Sydney hesitated before taking his hand. The contact was electric. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the air in the gallery, and he held her hand a second too long, not enough to be aggressive, but enough to make the air between them thick with a sudden, unearned intimacy. "I'm a resident," Sydney replied, her voice steady despite the flush she felt rising under her coat. "I didn't realize my house was a local landmark." "It's a masterpiece of exposure," Julian murmured, his gaze sweeping over her face with a clinical yet hungry intensity. He began to walk, subtly guiding her toward a private wing of the gallery, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The touch was through the fabric of her coat, yet Sydney felt it as if it were skin on skin, a slow burning pressure that made her stomach flip. Living in a house of glass, it's an invitation, isn't it? To be seen, to be studied, to be known. "I moved here for the privacy," she countered, though she didn't pull away from his touch. "Privacy is just a performance for an audience of one," Julian said, leading her into a room bathed in a deep crimson light. On the wall was a single photograph, a grainy black and white shot of a woman standing at a window, her silhouette framed by the night. It looked uncannily like Sydney's house. "No, it was Sydney's house. I took that last week. I hope you don't mind." The way the moonlight hit the glass, it looked like a confession. Sydney's blood ran cold, yet a dark, forbidden thrill raced alongside it. The ambiguity of his presence was intoxicating. Was he a stalker, or just an artist obsessed with the final girl aesthetic? The soap opera drama of the encounter felt like a trap she was walking into with her eyes wide open. "You were watching me," she whispered. Julian stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could smell the sandalwood and dark chocolate on his breath. He leaned down, his lips inches from her ear, mirroring the posture of the ghosts that haunted her sleep. "I was appreciating you, Sydney. There's a difference. Most people see the survivor. I see the woman who survived by becoming more dangerous than the men who hunted her." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, his touch firm and possessive. He didn't look for a pulse, he looked for a reaction. "You're shivering, Sydney. Is the gallery too cold? Or is it the realization that the glass in your house works both ways?" The physical tension was a coiled spring. Julian's hand moved from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling slightly in her hair. It was a gesture of dominance, yet it felt like a caress. He was studying her, the way her chest rose and fell in ragged intervals, the way her eyes darkened with a mixture of fear and a rising traitorous desire. "I have a dinner party tonight," Julian murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "A small gathering. People who appreciate the finer points of a story. I'd like you to be there. As my guest of honor." He pulled a small silver key from his pocket and pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers over it with his own. The metal was cold, but his hand was a furnace. "It's for the garden gate. The private entrance. I think you'd prefer to arrive, unseen." He stepped back, the intensity of the moment breaking as a group of patrons entered the room. But the look he gave her, a slow, hooded glance that promised a night of beautiful deceptions, left Sydney breathless. She left the gallery and stepped back into the fog, the silver key clutched in her hand like a weapon or a prayer. The encounter had been a calculated seduction, a psychological game played by a man who knew exactly which ghosts she carried. As she walked toward her glass fortress, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She didn't look at the screen. She knew who it was. The caller, the artist, the ghost, they were all merging into a single dark melody. The second phase of the aftermath had begun, and for the first time, Sydney wasn't sure if she wanted the lights to come back on. The final movement of Sydney's symphony didn't begin with a scream, but with the soft metallic click of the silver key turning in the lock of Julian Vane's private garden gate. The air inside the estate was different, thick with the scent of crushed jasmine and damp earth, a sensory trap that felt like a warm hand over a mouth. Sydney moved through the darkness of the topiary garden, her gown a liquid slip of obsidian silk that whispered against her legs. She felt exposed, yet for the first time, the exposure was her weapon. She wasn't just walking into a trap, she was walking into her own reflection. The dinner party was not the social gathering she had expected. There were no caterers, no polite conversation, no clinking of silver against china. Instead, the main hall of Vane's cliffside mansion was bathed in a deep cinematic amber light. A single long table of black glass sat in the center of the room, set for three. "You look like a secret that's finally ready to be told," Julian's voice drifted from the balcony above. He descended the stairs with a predatory grace, his eyes locked on her with a hunger that was no longer clinical. He reached the bottom and stood before her, the heat from his body radiating through the thin silk of her dress. He didn't offer a hand this time, he reached out and traced the line of her collarbone with the back of his fingers, a slow dragging movement that made Sydney's breath hitch. "Where are the others, Julian?" she whispered, her heart hammering a frantic rhythmic beat against her ribs. "There are no others, Sydney. There is only the performance," he murmured, his face dropping inches from hers. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, mirroring the ghosts of the past. "This is the final act. The moment where the final girl stops running and realizes she's the one holding the camera." He guided her toward the table, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. The friction was a provocation, a slow-burn intimacy that blurred the lines between fear and a dark, forbidden desire. As they sat, the wall behind them, a massive array of high-definition screens, flickered to life. Sydney froze. The screens didn't show art. They showed her. Every chapter of her life was there, but edited with a voyeuristic soap opera intensity. There was the library in Woodsboro, the conservatory, the glass house in Big Sur. But there were also scenes she didn't recognize, private moments in her bedroom, the way she looked when she thought she was alone, the way she had touched the dried rose petal Julian had sent her. "You've been curating me," she breathed, a wave of cold dread followed by a searing white-hot heat. "I've been worshipping you," Julian corrected, his eyes dark with an obsessive light. He leaned across the table, his hand covering hers. His grip was a trap, a possessive claim. "Billy and Stu were amateurs, Sydney. They wanted to break you to satisfy their own petty grievances. I want to immortalize you. I want to show the world that the Prescott curse isn't a tragedy, it's a triumph of the dark." The phone on the table, the same one that had been silent since Phase 1, began to vibrate. Julian didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on Sydney. "Answer it. Let's hear what the ghost has to say." Sydney picked up the phone with a trembling hand. She held it to her ear, the silence on the other end a heavy, humid weight. "Do you finally see it, Sydney?" The voice wasn't Julian's. It wasn't Billy's or Stu's. It was a perfect digital mimicry of her own mother's voice, Maureen Prescott. "You were always meant for the spotlight, darling. The blood is just the makeup. The pain is just the lighting." The ambiguity of the moment shattered Sydney's reality. Was this a deep fake? A ghost in the machine? Or had the story finally consumed her entirely? She looked at Julian, and for a heartbeat, his face seemed to shift, his features blending into the dark, seductive silhouettes of every man who had ever tried to own her. "It's time to stop fighting the legacy, Sydney," Julian whispered, standing up and moving behind her. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs massaging the tension in her neck with a terrifying rhythmic pressure. "Join the gallery. Be the masterpiece you were born to be." He leaned down, his lips ghosting over her neck, a breath away from a kiss that would be a final surrender. The physical tension was a coiled spring, a desperate gasping climax to months of psychological warfare. Sydney felt the weight of the story, the pull of the dark DNA that Julian so worshipped. Then, she looked at the screens. She saw the version of herself that they had created, the victim, the muse, the broken girl. "You're right, Julian," she said, her voice dropping into a low predatory purr that made him freeze. She turned in his arms, her body flush against his, her hands sliding up his chest to find the pulse in his throat. "I am a masterpiece. But you forgot one thing." She leaned in, her lips touching his in a kiss that was both a promise and a threat. It was a moment of total, shocking intimacy, a sensory overload that made the air in the room feel electric. Julian's grip on her tightened, his eyes fluttering shut in a moment of perceived victory. The creator, she whispered against his mouth, always survives the work. In one swift, cinematic motion, Sydney didn't reach for a knife. She reached for the silver key she had kept in her palm. With the same clinical precision she had used in the library, she jammed the jagged end of the key into the control panel of the black glass table. The room erupted. The screens shattered, sparks flying like static-charged rain. The smart wiring of the house went into a violent, strobing frenzy. In the chaos, the boundary between the performance and the reality collapsed. When the smoke cleared, the architecture of silence was literal. The house was a dark ruin on the cliffside. Julian Vane was gone. Whether he had fallen into the surf or vanished into the fog of his own creation, it didn't matter. Sydney stood on the edge of the terrace, the wind whipping her obsidian gown around her like a shroud. She looked out at the Pacific, the blue-white infinite stretching forever. She picked up the phone one last time. It was dead. She threw it into the ocean. She wasn't the final girl anymore. She wasn't the victim, and she wasn't the muse. She was the one who had walked through the fire and realized the fire was hers to command. The Prescott curse hadn't been broken, it had been mastered. As she walked away from the ruins of the glass fortress, her silhouette framed by the rising sun, she didn't look back. The story was finally hers.